A strike below or near the waterline is aimed at flooding the vessel rather than simply immobilizing it, a targeting choice that puts the ship at genuine risk of sinking and puts the crew at direct physical risk in a way that disabling a ship's propulsion does not. Iran, using that kind of strike against commercial shipping in the Strait, rather than the more surgical disabling tactics the U.S. has favored in its own blockade enforcement, is a meaningful signal about the level of risk Tehran is currently willing to impose on civilian mariners and commercial vessels caught in the middle of this conflict, regardless of which flag they're sailing under or which government's blockade they're technically violating. Now for the development that changes the character of this war more than anything happening directly between Washington and Tehran today. Yemen's Houthi movement announced a maritime embargo, but it's important to be precise about exactly what that embargo covers, because the actual announcement is narrower and more targeted than a blanket closure of the Red Sea to all shipping. A Houthi military spokesperson said the maritime ban specifically targets Saudi Arabia, describing it as an eye for an eye response to what the Houthis call Saudi Arabia's decade-long blockade of Yemen, layered on top of the recent Saudi-backed strike on Sana'a International Airport that was aimed at blocking an Iranian plane carrying a Houthi delegation home from Iran's supreme leader's funeral. The Houthi media office specifically said the Bab al-Mandeb Strait would be closed to Saudi Arabia, not to global shipping broadly, a distinction that matters enormously for understanding the actual scope of this specific threat. Bab al-Mandeb is the gateway between the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, and roughly 12% of the world's trade normally passes through it, which is why any disruption there, even one nominally targeted at a single country, tends to ripple outward into global shipping calculations, regardless of who it's technically aimed at. It's also worth noting what regional and American defense analysts have consistently assessed about Houthi capability specifically. The group lacks the actual capacity to fully shut down the Bab al-Mandeb outright, but it retains a real, demonstrated ability to harass vessels with missiles, drones, and small boats, tactics that have repeatedly disrupted Red Sea shipping in the past, even without achieving a complete closure. So, the honest read on this development is serious but bounded. A real targeted escalation against Saudi shipping specifically, layered onto an already fragile 4-year truce, rather than the second global choke point going instantly and completely dark the way the framing of a total shutdown might suggest. It's worth pausing on the economic significance of having two of the world's most important maritime choke points under active threat at the same time, because global energy markets don't process that kind of simultaneous disruption the way they process a single isolated event. The Strait of Hormuz alone normally carries roughly a fifth of the world's oil and petroleum product trade. Bab al-Mandeb carries around 12% of global trade more broadly, oil and non-oil cargo alike, and disruption there forces shipping companies to reroute around the Cape of Good Hope off South Africa, adding thousands of miles and substantial time and cost to voyages that would otherwise transit the Red Sea directly. Having both choke points under active threat simultaneously, even if the Houthi threat is currently bounded to Saudi-flagged shipping, specifically rather than universal, means insurers, shipping companies, and energy traders now have to price in disruption risk across two separate routes at once, a genuinely different calculation than pricing risk on a single contested waterway. That compounding effect is part of why markets have continued reacting to developments in this war even months after the initial shock of February and March, because each new front doesn't just add to the existing uncertainty, it multiplies the number of ways a single bad week could disrupt global energy supply simultaneously from multiple directions. It's worth understanding why the international system hasn't been able to resolve the underlying Strait of Hormuz dispute through diplomatic channels months into this crisis, because it's not for lack of trying. Back in April, the UN Security Council voted on a resolution aimed at reopening the Strait of Hormuz, watered down repeatedly in hopes of avoiding a veto, first stripped of any authorization for offensive military action, then stripped of Security Council enforcement authority entirely, reduced to language that would have merely encouraged states to coordinate defensive efforts. Even that diluted version was vetoed by both Russia and China, with Iran's UN ambassador praising the veto for preventing what he called shielding the United States and Israel from accountability, while America's ambassador said no one should tolerate a resolution failing that would have addressed a threat to the global economy. That veto happened months ago, but it's still the reason there's no functioning international mechanism actively working to de-escalate the maritime dimension of this conflict today. Whatever gets resolved about shipping through Hormuz or Bab al-Mandeb is going to happen through direct action by the parties involved, or not at all, because the Security Council's own gridlock has already closed off the collective diplomatic route months ago. On the diplomatic track that is still functioning, mediators have proposed a 10-day ceasefire to Iran, specifically aimed at creating space for negotiating teams to revive the interim agreement reached last month, the same memorandum of understanding whose collapse triggered this entire renewed phase of fighting. That proposal is on the table right now, Alongside American strikes that have hit an industrial manufacturing facility in Markazi province in central Iran, additional bombing runs on Shiraz targeting what's believed to be missile launch infrastructure used in today's barrage, and strikes on an electrical industries facility in Sanandaj. Whether that 10-day window produces anything is genuinely uncertain, and it's worth being honest that Iran's own public position, including recent statements from its Supreme Leader's office accusing the United States of violating the agreement first, doesn't currently suggest a government eager to sign on to another pause on terms it's already characterizing as broken by the other side. President Trump's own public messaging this week has been unusually direct and personal in its framing, a shift worth taking seriously rather than dismissing as rhetoric. He posted that every time Iran kills an American soldier, Iran will pay for that killing many times over, and said that directive has been passed personally to Secretary of War Pete Hegseth, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Dan Kane, and every leader in the military. That's a specific, on-the-record commitment to a doctrine of disproportionate retaliation for future American casualties, not just a general statement of resolve, and it sets an expectation for how Washington will respond if the death toll climbs further. Trump is also scheduled to attend the dignified transfer of the fallen service members' remains at Dover Air Force Base, with the White House confirming the president and staff are keeping the families in their thoughts during that process, a detail that underscores how directly this specific set of casualties has registered at the highest level of the American government, beyond the routine strike and statement rhythm that's defined most of this war's daily coverage. Dignified transfer ceremonies at Dover carry particular political and symbolic weight in American public life, specifically because they're one of the few moments in a modern war where the human cost becomes visually and personally unavoidable for the country's civilian and military leadership simultaneously, rather than being processed through the more abstract language of strike counts and target lists that dominates daily coverage of a conflict like this one. A sitting president's personal attendance at that ceremony, rather than delegating it to the Secretary of War or another official, is itself a signal about how seriously this specific set of losses is being treated at the very top of the American government. And it tends to shape the emotional and political register of everything the administration says publicly in the days immediately surrounding it, including, quite plausibly, the specific tone and personal framing of Trump's retaliation directive issued around the same time. It's also worth noting, separately from the immediate military and diplomatic picture, that threats specifically targeting President Trump personally have escalated alongside everything else this month. An Iranian group operating with state media promotion has claimed to have raised more than $40 million in a bounty offered to anyone willing to kill Trump, framed explicitly as retaliation for American and Israeli strikes on Iran. That kind of claim is difficult to verify in terms of whether real funds actually exist behind it, and bounty announcements like this have a long history in Iran. U.S. tensions without necessarily translating into an operational plot. But it's a genuinely serious signal about the temperature of state-adjacent rhetoric coming out of Iran right now, and it sits alongside earlier, separately sourced intelligence reports this year describing actual assassination planning against Trump during his travel, which is a different and more operationally concerning category of threat than an online bounty campaign, even though both point in the same general direction. The $40 million bounty claim deserves a bit more scrutiny than a passing mention, precisely because bounty announcements like this have a long and specific history in the Iran-US relationship that's worth understanding for context. Iran has a documented track record of taking vicious retaliatory action against parties it holds responsible for perceived grievances, from the aftermath of the 1988 USS Vincennes incident, in which an American warship accidentally shot down an Iranian civilian airliner, killing all 290 people aboard, to the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie months later. An attack widely attributed to actors operating with support from state sponsors in the region during that same period of heightened tension. That history doesn't mean the current bounty claim represents an operational plot with real resources behind it, and it's genuinely difficult to verify from outside whether the claimed $40 million exists in any meaningful transferable form. But it does mean that dismissing this kind of rhetoric as empty noise, purely because previous bounty claims haven't always translated into successful attacks, would be its own kind of overconfidence. The correct posture is treating it as a serious signal of intent and institutional anger worth monitoring closely, without either panicking over an unverified dollar figure or assuming it's automatically harmless, because similar claims have circulated before without materializing into a specific successful attack. There's also a domestic security dimension to this war that's worth acknowledging honestly rather than glossing over, because it's affecting how people are able to even discuss this conflict safely. Escalating rhetoric around this war has been accompanied by a real increase in threatening behavior online, targeted at people covering or discussing the conflict, serious enough that platforms and individual creators covering this war have begun documenting and reporting threatening messages to authorities as standard practice rather than an exceptional one. That's not a small or incidental detail. A war this emotionally charged, running this long, generating this much graphic footage and this much casualty news on both sides, tends to radicalize the discourse around it, even among people who are just trying to follow along from a safe distance. And that's worth naming as its own consequence of this conflict, rather than treating it as separate from the war itself. It's worth going deeper into why the Houthi decision to strike specifically at Saudi Arabia, rather than at American or Israeli shipping directly, matters strategically for how this entire regional conflict is likely to evolve. The 2022 truce between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis had held for roughly 4 years, surviving even the intense regional turbulence of the broader Israel-Gaza war and the opening months of this current Iran conflict itself. That durability wasn't an accident. Both sides had genuine incentives to preserve it. Saudi Arabia was eager to avoid being pulled back into a costly, unwinnable ground war it had already fought to a stalemate once, and the Houthis had consolidated enough territorial control inside Yemen that further conflict with Riyadh offered diminishing returns relative to the risk. The specific trigger this time, a disputed flight carrying Houthi officials home from a funeral in Tehran, is a genuinely minor pretext relative to the 4 years of accumulated restraint it's now unraveling. And that mismatch between the size of the spark and the size of what it's threatening to reignite is exactly the kind of dynamic that tends to produce conflicts nobody actually wanted at the outset. Iran's own relationship to this specific escalation is also worth being precise about. Tehran didn't order the Houthi embargo directly as far as any public reporting indicates, but the underlying grievance driving it, a Saudi strike aimed at intercepting an Iranian aircraft, ties the Houthi movement's actions back to the broader US-Iran conflict, regardless of whether Tehran issued any explicit instruction. That's the same pattern visible throughout this entire war. Iran's core conflict with Washington keeps generating secondary conflicts through its allied and aligned networks, each one nominally independent, each one still tracing back to the same root cause. It's worth going inside Iran's actual command structure at this specific moment, because a multi-site, coordinated missile barrage like today's requires a functioning chain of command to execute, and understanding who's actually directing that chain matters for predicting what comes next. After Khamenei was killed in February, his son Mojtaba was installed as supreme leader roughly a week later, reportedly wounded in the same strike that killed his father, and multiple people familiar with internal Iranian deliberations have consistently described his actual role since taking the position as largely ceremonial rather than operationally decisive. Real military authority, according to sources tracking the earlier ceasefire negotiations, has rested with IRGC commander Ahmad Vahidi and a narrowing circle around the Supreme National Security Council, while Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi handles diplomacy and Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bakr Kalibaf, himself a former Guard commander, serves as connective tissue between the political, security, and clerical establishments. A coordinated barrage launched from 4 separate provinces simultaneously, hitting 3 different countries' worth of targets in the same window, suggests that whatever fragmentation exists at the top of Iran's political structure, the IRGC's own operational and logistical capacity to execute a synchronized strike remains intact, which is itself an important and somewhat sobering data point. Command centers being struck repeatedly throughout this war clearly hasn't eliminated Iran's ability to coordinate this specific kind of action, even if it may be degrading the broader coherence of Iran's overall strategic decision-making. There's also the still unresolved nuclear dimension sitting underneath everything happening today, one that hasn't gone away just because the last several weeks of coverage have focused on shipping and troop casualties instead. During the original 12-day war in mid-2025, the United States struck Iran's underground nuclear facilities at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan with GBU-57 bunker buster bombs. A strike, a preliminary Defense Intelligence Agency assessment concluded, had only set Iran's weapons capability back by months rather than years, in part because Iran appeared to have relocated much of its enriched uranium stockpile beforehand. That stockpile, roughly 440 kilograms enriched to near weapons-grade levels, is believed to have survived, buried under rubble rather than destroyed. Pickaxe Mountain, the code name for a separate, even more deeply fortified facility in the same region, remains the target Trump has repeatedly and publicly named as primed for what he's called a big shot, reserved specifically for the B-2 Spirit and its massive ordnance penetrator. Every escalation happening today, the multi-front missile barrage, the Houthi embargo, the retaliation directive from Trump, is unfolding on top of that same unresolved question, and it's worth remembering that a war this volatile, with this many active fronts already open, is exactly the kind of environment in which a decision to finally strike that facility becomes both more operationally justified in the eyes of American planners and considerably more dangerous in terms of how Iran, and potentially Israel independently, might respond. Israel's own posture continues to sit just outside the direct fighting, watching and preparing without formally rejoining. Israeli officials have said repeatedly in recent weeks that the IDF is ready to conduct independent strikes against Iran for a third time if called on to, and has warned any renewed involvement would come with greater force than either of the two previous rounds this year. A day like today, with Iran demonstrating it can still coordinate multi-site missile launches against 3 separate countries simultaneously, is exactly the kind of development likely to reinforce Israeli assessments that Iran's military capability, however degraded by months of American strikes, remains functionally intact enough to justify continued high alert on Israel's part, regardless of whether Jerusalem ultimately decides the moment has come to act on it directly. There's a domestic political dimension in Washington worth factoring into today's developments as well, particularly given how directly Trump's retaliation statement engages with it. Both chambers of Congress, controlled by Trump's own Republican Party, passed war powers resolutions back in June directing the president to end hostilities with Iran, a largely symbolic but historically rare bipartisan rebuke that Trump publicly dismissed at the time. Public polling from around that same period found only about a quarter of Americans felt the war had been worth its cost. 17 confirmed American deaths, a number that will likely climb further in coverage as today's fighting is fully accounted for, represents a genuinely different political reality than the war Congress was voting on back in June, when American combat casualties from Iranian fire had been paused for months. Whether that shifts congressional or public sentiment toward more support for continued escalation, or accelerates the same war weariness that produced June's votes, is difficult to predict with confidence. And it's worth watching whether any of the Republicans who crossed party lines in June revisit their position publicly in the days ahead, now that the casualty picture has changed this significantly. It's also worth remembering that the Gulf and Strait of Hormuz fronts, and now the Red Sea front opened by the Houthis today, aren't the only theaters this broader conflict has generated. Iran's western border with Iraq has seen its own sustained, largely separate escalation for weeks now, with Iranian strikes on Kurdish opposition fighters, based in Iraqi Kurdistan, killing multiple people in coordinated waves across several provinces, part of a longer insurgency that intensified after Washington briefly and very publicly offered and then withdrew support for a Kurdish uprising against Tehran earlier this year. That front continues to run largely on its own momentum, disconnected from whatever happens with the 10-day ceasefire proposal currently on the table for the main U.S.-Iran track. And it's one more reminder of just how many genuinely separate conflicts this single war has already spawned across the region, each one capable of continuing to escalate independently of whatever progress, or lack of it, gets made on the headline Strait of Hormuz dispute. Stepping back to place today inside the broader arc of this conflict, it's worth remembering how we got here. This war began on February 28th, when Israel and the United States killed Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei in a coordinated strike, an event so consequential that Iran's entire subsequent strategy, closing the Strait of Hormuz, absorbing a punishing naval blockade that cost it an estimated $4.8 billion in lost oil revenue within its first 3 weeks alone, and eventually agreeing to an April ceasefire, followed by June's Memorandum of Understanding, has all unfolded in the shadow of that opening strike. The June agreement held for roughly 3 weeks before Iranian attacks on commercial shipping in early July collapsed it entirely, triggering the sustained nightly American strike campaign that's now run for more than a week and expanded from coastal military infrastructure into command centers, industrial facilities, and, following the deaths in Jordan, explicitly named retribution against the IRGC specifically. Today's multi-site missile barrage, the Houthi embargo against Saudi Arabia, the 10-day ceasefire proposal, and Trump's retaliation directive are not separate developments happening to unfold on the same day by coincidence. They're the latest data points in a single, continuously escalating conflict that keeps generating new fronts faster than any of the old ones get resolved. The honest strategic assessment tonight is that this war shows no sign of narrowing. Every diplomatic mechanism that might have contained it, the UN Security Council process back in April, the April ceasefire, the June memorandum, has either failed outright or collapsed under the weight of continued strikes on shipping. Every military threshold that's been crossed, coastal infrastructure to command centers, warning shots to disabled tankers, infrastructure targeting to explicitly named retribution against a specific organization, has been followed by a wider one rather than a return to the previous baseline. And now, a fourth government, Yemen's Houthi movement, has opened its own front against a fifth, Saudi Arabia, using the same maritime choke point tactics that have defined this entire conflict's economic dimension since the opening days. Whether the 10-day ceasefire proposal currently on the table produces anything or becomes the next entry on the growing list of paused negotiations that didn't hold is something that will likely become clear within days rather than weeks, given how quickly every previous pause in this war has either solidified into a real agreement or collapsed back into exactly the kind of multi-front missile exchange playing out across the region as this is being written. The structural problem with each of these proposed pauses has been consistent from the start. They tend to address the immediate trigger for whatever round of escalation just happened, a shipping incident, a casualty event, without resolving the underlying disputes that keep regenerating new triggers, who actually controls passage through the Strait, what happens to Iran's nuclear program, and how a fractured Iranian leadership structure is supposed to negotiate and then actually enforce commitments across its own competing centers of power. A 10-day window is not obviously long enough to make progress on any of those deeper questions, even under ideal conditions. And today's conditions, a fresh multi-site missile barrage, a newly opened Red Sea front, and a president who has just committed publicly to multiplying retaliation for future casualties, are not ideal conditions. What's not in question is the trajectory so far. 17 American deaths, at least 50 confirmed Iranian deaths this month alone, 2 major maritime choke points now under active threat simultaneously, and a president who has just put a personal, publicly stated commitment to escalating retaliation on the record. That's not a war entering its final chapter. That's a war whose middle keeps getting longer and more dangerous every time it looks like it might finally be winding down, and the honest measure of that isn't any single day's missile count. It's the fact that nearly 5 months in, the list of things that could still go wrong keeps growing faster than the list of things that have actually been resolved.